Us to talk about it from Ottawa are Major General retired Louis Mackenzie, the first commander of Sector Sarajevo, as Rudyard pointed out, and the Canadian ambassador to Yugoslavia at the time that war broke out, James Bissett. Ambassador Bissett, let me start with you. I'd like to return to that time 20 years ago when the Balkans were once again plunged into war and ask you, what was the trigger for that particular conflict?
Well, the trigger was really when the American ambassador persuaded Alija Izetbegovic, the Muslim leader in Bosnia, to renounce his signature and withdraw his signature from an agreement that had been reached earlier, negotiated by the Portuguese foreign minister. Portugal was the head of the EC at that time, and he had gotten the three parties together and they had signed what's now known as the Lisbon Agreement. And that meant that Bosnia could become independent, but there would be three autonomous regions. They all signed that, but my neighbor who lived across the street from me, Warren Zimmerman, the U.S. ambassador, convinced Alija Izetbegovic to renounce that agreement and declare unilateral independence, and that the United States would immediately recognize an independent Bosnia and establish the first Muslim state in the heart of Europe. Of course, anybody who'd been following the circumstances leading up to this knew that that meant a bloody civil war, because the Bosnian Serbs were not going to accept that.
Sure. Lou, let's bring you in at that moment. Canadian involvement, how did that start? And you were thrown right into the thick of it, weren't you?
Well, going on to the ambassador's comments, I mean, this wasn't a surprise. I mean, the international community could see it coming. It was so obvious to us who arrived on Friday the 13th of March, 1992 in Sarajevo with 100 staff officers and 25 soldiers to run the operation in Croatia. We were just a headquarters location. I mean, we could see it coming on the 6th of April when independence was going to be recognized, so much so that we did what Canadians do pretty well. We started a pool. Put in $10 and guess when the war starts. And one of my officers won a fairly significant amount of money for picking 3 o'clock in the afternoon of the 5th of April when the snipers opened up on the roof of the Holiday Inn. So, I mean, it didn't take a PhD in political science or 20 years in a diplomatic corps to see this thing coming, but the international community pretty well ignored it, and Ambassador Zimmerman, I think, bears some considerable responsibility, because this thing didn't have to happen. I mean, the plan that Coltiero, the Portuguese ambassador, was putting forward to us the day we arrived, when he told us we might as well go home because he'd solved the problem, that was pretty well the plan that was implemented in 1995, the Dayton Accord. The map's almost the same.
So this is, I mean, so many conflicts in hindsight, you can say that if only something different had happened, you wouldn't have had this bloody situation. But it was a pivotal moment for Canada. Our participation there definitely, I think, affected our presence on the world stage. Ambassador Bissett, can you comment on that and how the conflict in Sarajevo and our participation affected Canada's standing in the world?
Well, I think really it was the fact that we had a Canadian general there who was playing the role of arbiter between the two sides and trying to get food and humanitarian supplies into Sarajevo at a time that it was under siege. And the Canadians played a significant, important role there. And I think that did put Canada's name up front internationally.
Yeah, and I think we have to remember that the initial deployment to Sarajevo had a handful of Canadians, including myself. But when the airport agreement was brokered in late June, and the Canadian battalion, we borrowed the Canadian Vandu battalion, which included a company of the Royal Canadian Regiment, from the Croatian operation, because Canada had cheated more than any other unit in the entire 14,000-man force. We had brought 83 armored personnel carriers when we were told by the UN to bring only 13. So all of a sudden, that battalion was the most valuable battalion in the United Nations force, and it arrived in Sarajevo on the 2nd of July and stayed there for 30 days, keeping the airport open. One serious casualty, a foot blown off by a young soldier from Newfoundland. Other than that, well-trained, well-equipped, came to us from Germany in 6 hours on the train because we still had a brigade in Germany. So they made us all look good.
Ambassador, as we try to make sense of what happened with that conflict, how it started, and then how it was ultimately successfully resolved, are there some lessons that we should draw forward when we look at crises like Syria or potentially what's happening now in Libya, reports of extensive militia and factional and unfortunately ethnic fighting breaking out in that country too?
Well, yes, I think there are lessons there. But the first one that I would suggest is that Bosnia is probably the most misrepresented war in modern history. The Western media have presented it as a war between good and evil, between guys in black hats and guys in white hats. And they've identified very early that the Serbs started the war, the Serbs committed all the atrocities, and the Serbs did all of the so-called ethnic cleansing. Of course, that's a gross misrepresentation. They didn't start the war. They didn't want to secede from Yugoslavia, but they didn't want to live under a Muslim state. And ethnic cleansing was done on both sides. Atrocities were committed on both sides. And I think one of the lessons is that first of all, we should try and avoid taking sides in civil wars. It's always an ill-advised thing to do. It was ill-advised, I think, in Bosnia, and it was ill-advised in Libya. And we'll see what's happening in Egypt.
What about...
No, I think every effort should have been made to negotiate a peace and not to allow violence to take place.
What about lessons we can learn in terms of prosecution of war criminals, which unfortunately continue in other parts of the world? The prosecution of Radovan Karadzic, General Mackenzie, you were involved in that. You gave evidence at that. Can you sort of look back and see what we might take away from that prosecution that could be applied going forward?
Well, I think everyone who commits a war crime should have to look over their shoulders at the possibility of being tried as a war criminal. I mean, that's a good thing. I think perhaps the setup that the UN has established is a bit of a pork barrel for lawyers and judges around the world, considering they've only dealt with a handful of people. But nevertheless, nobody should be allowed to sleep at night if they're committing war crimes, the type that are being committed in Syria as an example. So from that point of view, it's a move in the right direction. But don't forget, in these conflicts, particularly in the Balkans, you were dealing with factions. You're not dealing with countries with leadership. You're dealing with factions, and when you broker a deal with them and they break it, you can't even find a leader the next day to protest or negotiate or whatever. It's much easier if presidents of countries are committing war crimes to get them to The Hague, except that, guess what? They never show up. You know, they just park at home, they have travel restrictions or whatever. So I think it's a move in the right direction, but look how long it took. Milosevic died in prison, for heaven's sakes, it took so long. Karadzic has been there for a few years. Mladic, he's so old now and suffering medically that he probably will not stand trial.
All right, fascinating conversation. Thank you, gentlemen, for this retrospective on the siege of Sarajevo. Ambassador Bissett and Major General Louis Mackenzie. Thank you.